Do you know who I am? I'm kind of a big deal.
Well, welcome to Overtime with Chip Franklin and Dr. Michael Jacobs, of Orioles former team physician. Doc, this is the midst of summer here, and right now and this week in New York City, it's going to be over 100 degrees, and many cities across the country where they're playing pro ball, they're dealing with these temperatures. It makes me wonder, now that if in the future all these stadiums are going to have to be and have the the ability to have a roof, because it seems like it's getting hotter and more dangerous to these guys as they stand out there, as we've seen this week with the Cincinnati shortstop.
Well, I think that's a bit of a leap.
Really?
Like Mike Bordick said, I think the players like playing in the heat. I know I always liked playing in the heat when I played competitive tennis. I think occasionally people will get overloaded, but the key there is that the training staffs understand the signs of people being affected by the heat and understand the treatment. It's all about prompt treatment. If you look at the few tragic cases, typically of football players who have passed away in preseason stuff, again, it's usually that the players were potentially overweight, not fit, that both the training staff and in some cases the coaching staff were a little bit behind the times in helping with them. So I personally don't think all stadiums need to be domed. I like playing in the heat. I think it's a little different in tennis, where a tennis match can go 5 hours. And when you watch some of those classic matches, whether it's Nadal, Djokovic, or Federer and somebody, and those guys are still running like bandits after 5 hours, I think some of those guys could collapse. But I think in baseball, it's not all that brutal on the players, and I think they adjust their warm-up schedules. But that's training staffs must know how to identify people at risk and how to treat them. MLB just sent out yesterday a list of warning signs and a great article, if you want to read it, published in the Journal of Athletic Training, of the different typical types of heat-affected disorders, from exercise-induced muscle cramps to what we call heat syncope, where players start getting a little dizzy, to heat exhaustion, where you start advancing to more serious conditions. And then, of course, you get into heat injury, where your body essentially boils its own internal organs, and that frequently leads to death, as it did, frankly, and sadly, to one of the Oriole players in the 20-some years ago, when in addition to trying to lose weight and perform, he was taking some over-the-counter drugs to lose weight, and he sadly expired, even though he got fantastic care from the training staff, where I think he went from the field to the hospital in about 8 minutes in an ice bath. Wow. But he still damaged his organs and passed away.
Does the heat bother heavier players more than in-shape players?
It depends what you mean by heavy. If you're a big man and you're fit, if you're a big man and you're fit and you're conditioned, I think the differences are limited. If you're clearly overweight and chubby, to use a different word, and more common again in the football scenario, but in our particular case, we had a somewhat overweight pitcher. He wasn't grossly obese, but he was trying to lose weight to make the team. And that definitely contributed to his demise, especially with some of the over-counter meds he was taking. But yeah, it's a failure of the coaching staff and the trainers to properly evaluate each player, and each player is unique, and some players you do have to be more careful with. But again, it's more common in football than baseball.
So you guys were talking earlier on the podcast about the number of injuries the Orioles have. And I was reading online, this is an exceptionally high number of injuries in the whole league this year, in the National League and the American League. And I'm wondering if you can put your finger on anything. Is it training? Is it, I don't know. I mean, what would be adding to the excessive number of injuries in Major League Baseball this year?
Well, as I look at it, and this is strictly my opinion, and it's kind of the art of medicine more than actual medicine, I think a lot of it is expanded diagnoses. I think with MRI scans being so sensitive, with agents being so protective of their players, with the legalities and the lawsuits that have gone down, I think that basically many players who've had some mild strains and mild injuries that in the past, particularly in the pre-MRI area, players would have been rested for a couple of days. They might have gone out and played at 80%. But a lot of those injuries probably would have healed without being on the DL for 3 weeks. But I think in today's hypercorrect society, and again, with the litigation that goes on, there's some crazy lawsuits out there that are making it very difficult to be a team physician. In fact, a number of very notable sports medicine groups have dropped their team affiliations because of the litigation risks. So I think we're diagnosing things earlier and we're trying to be more proactive in a good way with the long-term care of the player. But I think in that regard, it's just a matter of expanding the diagnoses and treating the players a little more aggressively than we would have in the past. I think there's no question that's going on with a lot of these core injuries, which were hard to diagnose prior to MRIs.
Do you think if Ripken came into the league in 1999 as opposed to 82, that record would have been unattainable? I mean, do you think just the way that we evaluate injuries and players today and all the money that's there, that 2632 that record will never be approached, much less broken?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. It seems to me that the game has, so many cameras and so many different angles and so much at stake, I think, for managers and management, that to win, that, if somebody just goes into a slight slump, there's no way they would have considered that. I mean, I never really looked at this, but how deep a slump Ripken had in his 17 seasons of the streak, that they ever thought about taking him out of the lineup and threatening that streak. I would imagine the streak at one point got the kind of life of its own that nobody dared touch it, right?
Well, yes. Number one, I think that in today's world, Cal would not have been able to play through some of the injuries he had. And you've got to remember, it's all part of the industrialization or the commercialization of the leadership. When in the old days, you're answering to a GM who played in the front office of all ex-players, be they major or minor, they had a perspective of the player. In today's corporate, that's the word I was seeking for. In today's corporate world where everything's siloed, these front office people who never played professional ball have a completely different approach to this, which in many ways is more player protective, but also in many ways does limit the player's ability to fight through some of these things. And I do think I do know pretty much for a fact that towards the end of the career, the Orioles weren't playing that well anyway in some regards. But I do think the streak took a life of its own, as it had to. I mean, that is such a monumental streak. It would be like pinch hitting for Joe DiMaggio, when he's going through his streak, even if that pitcher seems to have his number for the first 3 at-bats in that game. I don't think they're pinch hitting for Jolton Joe somehow.
It's interesting because of the guaranteed contracts baseball has. It makes me think that maybe, they're a little more protective of their investments than say football, where like you get hurt, you're gone, and and they stop writing checks essentially.
Well, there's no question that's true, and there's no question that again we've had this discussion. The 17 or 16 game schedule in football puts every game at a premium, and the toughness and dying on your sword, and just watch how particularly some of the second string players in the NFL play at 110% in blowout games, right? Because they know that gets the coach's attention. So there's the whole psyche of football, as well as the structure of it, is just different from not just the contracts, but the length of the season.
Yeah, I've always admired the pitchers that came in blowouts and they really pushed hard, because I mean, you come into a game, you're up 7 or 8 or 9-0 or down 9-0. It's in a lot of ways, I've heard managers say this, it's an opportunity. They want to see what you're made of, and moving forward, I think that, you go back to the Willis Reed kind of stuff. And I don't know if we're ever going to see that kind of, I don't know what the right word is for toughness, again. Well, it's there. That toughness is there. And I'm talking about the Willis Reed limping up and down. You know this story. But the idea that these players can perform when they're injured and to have a Kirk Gibson moment that that we just don't see that much anymore. A guy, can you imagine a guy limping up to home plate today to pinch it?
Well, again, that's playoff baseball. I think, a one swing kind of guy could happen again.
Maybe, yeah.
But at the same time, I think as you said earlier, the protection of the players long term has become key. And you still see it today. I mean, in all honesty, the Willis Reed, that whole series is burned in my head. The most exciting game I ever heard on the radio was the game where Willis went out. And the Knicks, the New York crowd was screaming defense so loud it was coming out of my radio. Marv Albert was losing his mind. The Knicks were running, Nate Bowman, Bill Hoskett, Stallworth to cover Wilt, and absolutely Walt Frazier took over the last 3 minutes of that game with Cazzie Russell. I remember it like yesterday.
Well, people got to go. If they don't know what we're talking about, go to YouTube and put Willis Reed injured Knicks game, and you can see it, and it is pretty remarkable.
You got to hear it. You got to see it on the radio, as they used to say. But the radio was even better. But in Game 7, that was just all about Willis walking on the court. And Jerry West said in one of those review shows about that game, he said as soon as he walked on the court and we heard the crowd, we knew we were going to lose. That was Jerry West talking.
Yeah.
But you just saw it the other day. Halliburton came out with a partially injured calf, which includes his Achilles tendon, and he went out and played on it until it snapped. So you still see it today. And basketball is not football, but it's still an action game where you can't just take a swing and crawl around the bases. So you still see that today, and Halliburton is a living example of it, that he played hurt and he aggravated the injury. I mean, there's no way out of that.
Before we go, real quick, I was telling somebody the other day that to watch Bird and Magic, the HBO documentary about it, because people forget about that the day. Well, if you're not old enough to remember when Johnson announced he had HIV, and the world was, of course, shocked, and players turned on him, and that was like not an injury that we'd ever had or heard of before, right? This kind of thing, and it also came with all of these fears and everything. That time was a really unique time in American sports history. I'll never forget it. And that's there's so many great stories and documentaries, and also dramatic retellings of these players that have fought through these injuries and made it. Just watching Hoosiers the other night when the kid got hurt and he came back in the game later. It's a big part of sports, and people love it, and it's always going to be there. A little bit of that. Dr. Michael Jacobs, former Orioles physician. I'm Chip Franklin. This has been Overtime. We'll see you next time.
Do you know who I am? I'm kind of a big deal.